We've been following special elections going back to Rob Quist in Montana, John Ossoff in Georgia, James Thompson in Kansas, who almost pulled off an upset victory. And in places like Oklahoma, you've been seeing these swings of like 30 points from November of 2016 to sometime in 2017. While you've had some kind of quisling Democrats, you've also had some really out there progressive ones who have also done extremely well. And you saw that come home to roost. You had in Virginia, for instance, a candidate backed by Democratic Socialists of America, and he upset the Republican whip, Jackson Miller. And he had broad support. He had support from kind of Clinton elements of the party. Planned Parenthood got behind him. And then the DSA got behind him. And that is what they have called in a lot of fascist countries, that's a popular front. That is everybody getting together and recognizing that there's a threat on the horizon and putting aside their internecine differences and uniting to push them over the top. Now, Ralph Northam in Virginia also won, which we described as a wet bag of mulch. I mean, this was the most boring candidate, and yet the anti-Trump energy out there dragged him over the finish line and gave him a 9-point win. In the same state that saw the KKK marching in Charlottesville something like 90 days ago, the state elected a black lieutenant governor and an extremely progressive attorney general. In Portsmouth, Virginia, a black woman prosecutor convicted a white cop for shooting a black teen. She won. In Manassas, Bob Marshall, one of the most retrograde kind of culture warriors that Virginia has had for a very long time, he sponsored the bathroom bill. Any kind of weird thing that you could say about immigrants, gay people, or trans people has probably come out of his mouth. Who did he lose to? A trans woman, Danica Rome, whose campaign went basically like this. All Bob Marshall wants to talk about is what bathroom I can use. All I want to talk about is how crappy traffic is on Route 28. And she won in the equivalent of a local landslide. In Washington State, a criminal justice reformer who was inspired to run by Donald Trump's win, won in a Senate special election, flipping the state Senate over to Democrats. There were a couple special elections in Georgia that flipped from Republican to Democrat. In New Jersey, Chris Christie left office with something like a 19% approval rating, and he was replaced by a Democrat, which is extremely important because this being New Jersey, the senator there, Bob Menendez, is on the brink of getting convicted of corruption. And so it's important who the governor is, because the governor is going to appoint the next senator. And in fact, it's kind of a race. It's kind of a race. Will Menendez get convicted and expelled from the Senate before there's a Democratic governor in? And what do they do if Chris Christie on his way out tries to make a last-minute appointment of, say, Chris Christie to be a senator, which changes the dynamic immensely, because when you have 52 senators and can only lose 2, that's a different ballgame than if you have 53 and you can lose 3. The person who ought to be the most nervous right now from the results from Virginia, I would say, is Roy Moore. This is a guy who's presumed to kind of coast to election here against Doug Jones down in Alabama. He's as crazy as Bob Marshall, if not crazier. It's been very hard to envision a scenario where Democrats can get to more than 50% in this runoff that's coming in December. But with the type of wave that you saw in Virginia, anything is possible. I would make one more point and then we can go to some questions. Last night also exposed one of the flaws in the engineering of gerrymandering, and that flaw is voters. In order to gerrymander a state or a region, what you need to do is rely on consistent voter behavior. So you have to try to push it as low as you can possibly go and still win comfortably. So you want let's say a 5, 6, 7 point advantage. And then for the Democratic districts, you let them win by 60. Absolute blowout. You put all of the black voters in one district and you let somebody win in unopposed or 90-10. That's basically how gerrymandering works. To really stretch it, you've got to give yourself a very little room for error. Democrats won by like 9 points. So that means that these gerrymandered districts, while they're comfortable Republican districts, they're not comfortable if you're seeing swings of 10 points. And so if you've got this like 5, 6 point edge that in a normal year is something that a good candidate is comfortably going to win on, everything changes if voters change their minds. And so, voters were revealed last night to be the real flaw, or the only weakness in the gerrymandering strategy.
Mike Lynn has a question. He wants to know, in light of last night's elections, what are the trends, left versus right, but also progressive versus establishment?
So the establishment, the trend is definitely left. Like everywhere you look, the one version of the left is beating a version of the right, whether it was the evangelical, ultra-conservative lunatics like Bob Marshall, or whether it was the Ed Gillespie lobbyist, centrist, who's trying to play this race-baiting card. All center to right, they all did poorly in last night's election, and so poorly that Democrats went into the House of Delegates race with a 32-seat gap. And depending on how the recounts go, they could even claim the House of Delegates, which nobody thought was even remotely possible. Now, on the left, you had the establishment hung on in some places, and you had populist insurgents win elsewhere. In Minneapolis, Ginger Jensen, she ran on the Socialist Alternative ticket for city council, and irony of ironies, she won on the first ballot. But Minneapolis is such a progressive city that they have kind of ranked choice balloting, which means that you rank the people that you want. So you want Ginger, the socialist, as your first vote, and then you want the most liberal Democrat as your second vote, and then for your third vote, you vote for the centrist Democrat. So she won by something like 500-600 votes in the first balloting, but it wasn't a majority. So then you factor in second balloting. And there was a Democrat there who it looked to me, the pattern looked like lots of Ginger's voters voted for the Democrat as their second choice. And the Democrat may wind up leapfrogging her and winning that one. In Seattle, establishment Democrats hung on in an election there. In Atlanta, we wrote a lot about Vincent Fort and talked about him. He was a Bernie supporter who was running for mayor, a longtime activist, city councilman. He lost. He didn't make it into the runoff between the Republican and the top Democrat. Obviously, Ralph Northam was the establishment choice in Virginia, though Fairfax, the lieutenant governor, is much more progressive, and the attorney general of Virginia, much more progressive. You had DSA members, a good chunk of them, I think a couple won in Pittsburgh, a couple big wins there. We have a story up at the Intercept that'll give you a bunch of these names of people and where they won. In Columbus, where we've written about before, there was a slate of 5 progressives who were trying to take on the Democratic establishment in Columbus, Ohio. 3 of them had Our Revolution's backing. All 5 of them ended up losing. But in many other places, extremely progressive, outspoken Democratic Socialists, serious progressives won last night, and it's all thanks to Trump, really.
About Ralph Northam, I mean, he did defeat Tom Perriello, who was the progressive choice, but Perriello did a funny thing. Instead of putting his head in a sling for the last several months and complaining, he got out there to make a difference in the election, and he probably made the difference by uniting the progressive coalition.
And yes, Tom Perriello basically kind of coordinated the effort to try to take back the House of Delegates. And what's unfortunate for Democrats is that Tom Perriello's kind of argument for why he was running was that he was going to try to create the kind of wave that that would take back the House of Delegates and then let him actually govern in a progressive way, whereas Northam was always content to try to win the governorship, to try to stave off bad things from happening, whereas Perriello was saying, no, I think it's possible that we could win the House of Delegates, and the way we're going to win is we're going to rack it up in the blue areas, but then with somebody like me who can make kind of this anti-monopoly, populist argument that's going to resonate in Southwest Virginia and outside of Charlottesville, we can flip some of those seats too. And I think if you look at the map, if you move a few more votes in some of those areas that Perriello was talking about, then they might end up taking the House of Delegates anyway. I don't think they will. It'll be close with the recount. But you move a few more votes that direction, that plan might actually have worked for him.